Hello everyone, welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Review Roundup. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the latest and sometimes greatest films coming to a cinema near you. Today we are talking about Springsteen, Deliver Me From Nowhere, directed by Scott Cooper. Bruce Springsteen, a young musician, you may have heard of him, on the cusp of global superstardom, struggles to reconcile the pressures of success with the ghosts of his past. But before we go any further, if you haven't yet, please like this video. It really helps with engagement and the algorithm, and people find the channel. And since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way you'll never miss reviews like this. This is going to be mainly a pseudo-spoiler review, but we can and will get into full spoilers at the end, so I can read out your comments and questions. So to that end, put comments and questions in the live chat. If you're watching this live, first of all, welcome, right? Second of all, conversations like this are always more interesting when we can have a dialogue. So, as I'm kind of going through my own thoughts, let me know what you think. Unless it's something like offensive, I will read every comment and question from the live chat. If you're watching this after the fact, we're still super happy to have you. By the time you're watching this, there should be time codes in the description, so you can kind of jump around at your leisure. And you should definitely subscribe, so that way you can join us live next time. So, looking here, kind of bird's eye view. My impression when watching the film, all throughout, but then especially once I walked out of the theater, is that the film's fundamental flaw, right? And that's the kind of review this is, kind of, starting with the biggest flaw. Not to say that this is a bad movie per se, but the film just can't seem to muster the same level of vulnerability and idiosyncrasy that Bruce Springsteen captured, or captures, or is trying to capture in this movie, with his album Nebraska, the making of which this film is more or less about. And I say more or less about because the film can't really decide if it wants to be a hyper-focused exploration of the music-making process and how that reveals things about the music makers. It's not sure if it wants to be that, or if it just wants to be like your run-of-the-mill music biopic, right? And by trying to kind of be both, it doesn't really do either well. Just looking at the genre in general, the often lampooned, often maligned genre of the music biopic, they're often, if not definitionally, they mythologize and aggrandize their subjects. And this film is no exception, right? The final film, the version that, you're going to see in theaters, mercifully cut out that speech that Jeremy Strong gives as John Landau in the trailer, where he's like, the very generic music biopic things like, he's changing the world and blah, 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 blah. And, I love Bruce Springsteen. I love a lot of his music. But, sometimes these films, even if some of the things they're saying are true, it feels like a little hyperbolic within the narrative, right? And so much of our experience of the narrative is just being told how great his music is, right? Even if it's true, right? Even when we're getting to hear it and you like it, ultimately music and art is subjective, or your opinion of it is subjective, right? There's a lot of tell, not show, right? It's a lot of, he's a genius, this song is great, or this feels right, and it's kind of like the script wants us to take that as a given, even though those are very subjective kind of things, right? So the pushback that Bruce gets in the film kind of serves to reinforce this idea of how great Nebraska is. Almost like all these characters who are kind of doubting him, it's supposed to give us a sense of dramatic irony. We know something that they don't know, we know that the final product is going to be incredible, and we know it's going to become successful and really well regarded, right? And I found that kind of conflict a little forced, right? Because I was sitting there wondering, and maybe it's because, I'm sitting here in 2025, full disclosure, I grew up listening to Bruce Springsteen. My father's probably the biggest Bruce Springsteen fan. I'm not sure if you're watching, Dad. Hello. So I've been inundated with Bruce Springsteen music forever, right? But I was born in the late 90s. So by the time I'm conscious enough to understand what my father's playing in the car, my father is a diehard Bruce Springsteen fan, so, the entire catalog is being presented to me. For me, there was no delineation necessarily between here's this earlier period, and then here's this post-Born the USA, there was none of that. So maybe for me, hearing Nebraska, which I admittedly haven't really sat down and listened through ever, and that's something I want to try to get to at some point, it didn't seem that out of character, right? Now, if I kind of put on my 1982 hat, right, and think about the music he had released before that, it definitely would have been a genre shift. But I guess I just struggle with, why is this new direction for Bruce so ridiculous? Obviously, it's a departure from his prior work, but was folk music... Was it really this toxic, unsellable genre in the early 1980s? It kind of feels trumped up. And furthermore, at least in the movie industry, I know there's often a thing where it's like you may have like a director and they'll kind of work something out with the studio where it's like, okay, I'll make your generic big blockbuster studio movie if you then let me make this other movie I actually want to make, right? Kind of like the one for you, one for me. It feels like if I was Jeremy Strong's character, I would have just presented that to the record company. Be like, look, we have all these bona fide hits. We have Born to Run. We have I'm on Fire. We have all these great, like that song. Like I think they even say in the movie about Born to Run, that like that you could just have Born to Run and 11 other songs and no one would care because it just has Born to Run, right? So I feel like if I was Jeremy Strong, if I was John Landau, I would have just said like, look, we have all these hits in the bank, like. Let us work on this one. We'll kind of do a one for you, one for me thing, right? So again, it just felt like it was there to create a conflict of people doubting Bruce's artistic vision, or at the very least minimizing his personal expression, right? Another issue with this and with music biopics, right? Because this is based on a true story, you're essentially writing backwards from an ending that you have no choice over. Now, granted, you can choose, okay, where do you end the story? Right? But ultimately, your ending is always going to be decided on, and you're kind of working backwards. And the consequence of this is that you can't always go narratively where your story may naturally be pulling itself towards, right? I went to go see this with my father, and I went with my fiancée Viviana, and Viviana remarks that she saw a lot of similarities in the Bruce character, like divorce this from the fact this is based on a real guy. The Bruce character reminded her a lot of Bradley Cooper's character in A Star Is Born, right? This like this really good guy at heart, but he's just really, troubled and haunted, right? And, I don't think this movie would have been better if Bruce Springsteen killed himself at the end, like Bradley Cooper does, spoiler alert, for a film that came out 7 years ago. But that's just like one potential outcome for this character of Bruce. Again, the character of Bruce. But that's an outcome that's foreclosed, right? Like that just can't happen. And that just kind of goes to show the limitations of doing a film like this, right? After the film, my dad was asking me questions sincerely. He was like, why when people make these kind of movies, like why do they change facts that it's so easy to get it right? And I think his implication was like, oh, they fucked up, like they messed up, like they got it wrong. By accident, and 9 times out of 10, it's an intentional choice, right? Now we can then debate if it was worth that change, but I'm usually not holding things super sacred. If it's based on a true story of it being like, like exactly how everything happened and played out, because ultimately real life doesn't usually fit a neat, satisfying arc. Just because someone's music is interesting, doesn't mean that their story is interesting to tell in a 3-act narrative format, right? Ultimately, because it's based on a true story, there's only so many, really your only choices with how you end the story, and ultimately endings are what make the story, that give it its thematic kind of point, right? The way it ends. You can't choose how it ends. You can really only change where you end your story in someone's life, right? But again, it's not completely slavish to the music biopic genre, right? The director Scott Cooper, he eschews the classic storyline that we've seen a million times in these music biopics, where you see their meteoric rise from the bottom, their struggles at the top, and then their ultimate resolution somewhere in the middle. But here's the thing, though, right? While that structure is cliche, and would be cliche if applied here, there's a reason it's cliche, right? It's incredibly functional, right? It has a very clear structure. It has a built-in drama and stakes, right? So instead of getting that, in its stead is a narrative that arguably shouldn't even really be called a narrative. It has a very mushy structure and very sluggish pacing. And if the film, really wanted to break away from the conventions that plague the genre, it really should have just honed in on the music making process, right? Which was the more interesting part of the movie, right? Because the film's already light on plot. And this is what I was saying before, that kind of is trying to straddle these two different visions of what the movie could be. So the film's already very light on plot, so, just kind of go all in on the music making process, and this focus, you could do it almost like very cinema verite, where we're really in the room with them. And I've always found with writing, specificity reveals the universal, right? I think sometimes people, and this applies for so many movies, not just music biopics, but especially something like this, we don't want to get into the weeds because people aren't going to know about. I think it is in the specificity of lived experience and the experiences of characters that reveals the universal that we can connect to, right? When you try to make your movie universal, it's usually not going to land, right? So I feel like get in the weeds, make it really cinema verite, like ditch the self-aggrandizing. Just let the music speak for itself in the process, right? So we can then appreciate the final product because we've been there at every step of the grinding of it, right? I'll give you an example, and I didn't know this, and this was kind of cool to learn, is that Born in the USA was originally written as this completely different kind of song. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, I'm really interested to see, like, how it gets from A to Z there. And then the next time we hear Born in the USA, they're in the studio recording the version that we know and love, right? Like, that would have been cool to see, like, that kind of, that gnashing of teeth and that pulling teeth and the, the tug and pull between different creative personalities and the hard work of trying to find that. And that's why art is always so interesting, is because to be an artist and to make art, you have to be vulnerable. So all of this to say, it's not just because the music making process would be more interesting, but I think it would have made for a more interesting character piece, because the music making process, or any art making process, you have to be vulnerable, so it's going to reveal things about the character, but most importantly, Bruce. So we get to explore, the film would have been a stronger vehicle to explore Bruce as a character. But ultimately, he's just ultimately too afraid to fully commit to that. Or maybe the studio is too afraid to commit to that. So we have to include the externalities of it, right? We have to include a romantic through line with a fictitious character, by the by. When I turned to we were watching this in the theater, my dad turned to me and was like, she's not even real. I was like, what do you mean she's not real? I was like, she's made up. Like, she's a completely fictitious person. And I was like, maybe she's like a composite? But from doing some research, it's not even like she's a composite of like some very specific people. She really is her own invention for the movie. And it's obvious why they added her, right? It's obviously there to show how his personal issues are affecting his relationships. But if you're gonna do that, you need to do a more traditional biopic, right? Like, I always compare filmmaking to like making food, right? Which is weird because I'm not like an expert in that by any means. But you're not gonna judge a cake off of how good the sriracha sauce is on it, right? Like it has different ambitions. So this movie didn't need a romantic through line and a well-developed romantic through line if it's gonna really be focused on the music making process. But because it's kind of trying to have its cake and eat it too, no pun intended. Okay, well, if you're gonna do that, then you really need to commit to that as well. Like, you need to have enough there. And more importantly, show how they're connected, right? I never really got a sense that the issues with the music and the issues with his romantic life are correlated, but they're not, they're both from the same source, but they don't really seem to inform the other, right? And I think they were trying to they get kind of paid lip service to this idea that Bruce, can't really give someone what they need, because he's just like, he's gonna be on tour, he's gonna be like, he needs to be like alone for like 3 weeks at a time just to write, and and that's an interesting idea, but then the film isn't really saying it's related to the music, it's really related to these personal issues, right? And it's just, the film doesn't really quite know what it wants, how it wants to approach it, right? All this being said, though, the romantic through line, it's certainly functional, right? And Odessa Young, the actress who plays the character, this fictitious character named Faye, she does a good job. But again, the reasons for her character's invention and this through line's inclusion are crude and obvious, right? And ultimately, it's just a dilemma of any film that's heavily based on a true story, right? How much do you change, and why do you make those changes, right? I don't believe anything is sacrosanct, as long as if it's helping the story, I think that's almost, you have to make those changes. And as long as you're not creating a different impression, right? If you're giving an impression of a certain character's kind of qualities, and in the events of the film, whether fictitious or not, are giving a different impression, then that's a problem, right? Because it's dishonest in a fundamental way, rather than like, oh, well, this event literally didn't happen, right? So like, looking at the characters here, specifically character, I think there's really only one interesting character to talk about, and of course that's Bruce Springsteen, right? Because of the issues with this directorial vision, the exploration of this character, while interesting, it just doesn't live up to its potential, right? And Jeremy Strong's portrayal of John Landau, even at one point, explicitly makes this point. Again, a lot of tell, not show. He explicitly makes the point that on some level, Bruce, the reason why Bruce is going through all this and he's in this new direction he's going into, it's a reflection of his anxiety, that he's aware on some level that he's about to transcend to another level of stardom. In Nebraska, this album, or the ethos of this album, is his attempt to hold on to something that is slipping through his fingers. I found it surprising, for most of the movie, he's just kind of walking around his New Jersey streets and he's not getting mobbed. And at one point, someone even shouts out their window, like, "You suck, Bruce!" So, once he gets to that certain level, he's not gonna be able to walk around his hometown in the same way, at least, right? Like, they're just going out to eat. Like, he's famous, but he's not this level of global superstardom that he is going to get once you get into the mid-'80s with Born in the USA, right? And this is a really interesting idea. And full disclosure, it's always an interesting idea for me. I went to NYU for film school. My whole thesis film was about this idea of something slipping through your fingers and desperately trying to cling to it, but it's gonna disappear regardless. Like, you're on this trajectory, right? But if they wanted to really explore this idea, then maybe they should have done a more traditional storyline, right? Where we could see him starting out right before he becomes at least that initial phase of being famous. So that we can at least get a better sense of what he's afraid to lose, right? Because as it stands right now, we only see him in this weird in-between transitional moment. I was surprised. I thought there was going to be more flashbacks to at least when he was an adult doing his career. Of course, there's flashbacks when he's a kid, and we'll talk about that. But, yeah, I think, again, a lot of this movie is like, okay, that is an interesting thing you're doing, but if you're going to do that, you need to do more. You need to kind of commit to that. And again, the film almost seems to position this anxiety, okay, that's kind of what's causing all this. But then the film also tries to position his upbringing, specifically his relationship with his father, who's like this mean drunk, right? That it's this upbringing and this relationship that are the key to understanding who Bruce is, right? But the film doesn't really make a compelling case as to how that trauma impacts his present struggles, right? We get like the obligatory panic attack scene that you get in so many movies like this, but it's never really clear. Like, it makes sense why he has trouble connecting romantically or maintaining romantic relationships. But again, it's just not really clear why. I mean, they also pay lip service that it's not so much the trauma that he experienced from his father, but rather Bruce has his own mental health issues, which are genetic. Like, everyone in his family has them, and that's why his father was the way he was. But again, it just doesn't quite thread the needle on that. And furthermore, the film also suggests there's this issue of him, he doesn't really know who he is, right? And in this sense, Nebraska is his attempt at self-actualization, right? There's like the line in the trailer, and then it was in the movie, obviously, when he's buying a car, and the car dealer is like, "Oh, I know who you are," and he's like, "Well, that makes one of us," right? And that's an interesting idea, but again, it just doesn't all come together, right? You could have all these interesting ingredients, but if you fuck up the timing of how long you simmer something, right, it's just not going to work. Jeremy Allen White, he does a fine enough job as Bruce Springsteen. I put this in my Letterboxd review. This might be the only biopic where the actor is less good looking than the actual guy. Just because Jeremy Allen White has a very specific kind of look, and Bruce Springsteen is just like a super, very handsome man, especially at this point in his life, right? But all joking aside, the thing that's a little disappointing is White is a phenomenal actor. He just doesn't get enough to work with here. He's known for his range, or at least that's how I respect him, of being able to do like the more controlled kind of characters versus like someone who's really blowing up. Yet he's kind of neutered here, right? And because the film isn't sure what aspects of Bruce it wants to explore, or at the very least it's incapable of threading the needle and exploring all of them, ultimately the character's arc ends up being kind of flaccid, and that kind of reflects in the performance. Again, not really to the fault of Jeremy Allen White. I think with what he's given, he does a remarkable job. It's just, what he's given is kind of messy in terms of character work, right? And if nothing else, I mean, this kind of feels like a little reductive, but like, if nothing else, the film's well shot, right? Especially the scenes where Bruce is making the music, right? Either alone in his bedroom or in the recording studio or on stage, right? At a big concert venue. Which again, just made me want to focus on the music process even more. And the one thing that was kind of annoying, and I alluded to this before, is that Cooper employs this kind of black and white format for the flashbacks, which felt a little bit affectatious, right? It's obvious how they want us to feel, and it feels like it's reaching for more artistic credibility than it's earning. Stephen Graham as playing Bruce's father, the contrast that Graham brings between the mean drunk in the flashbacks to then the present day broken man that he is, like he's heavier, he's clearly struggling even worse with his mental health issues. I think his mom at one point mentions like he's hearing voices, so clearly it's more than just like, oh, he's depressed and he's just drinking, right? Like there's a lot going on there. And that contrast, seeing how people are when they're younger versus like once they've lived more of their life and they realize their mistakes and they really have to sit with their mistakes, that contrast was really effective, right? But the flashbacks themselves felt a little like, felt a little conventional, but not only conventional, but trying to make it seem like it wasn't conventional, right? And then of course the film is including Bruce's music, which of course it's iconic. So there was a pleasure in just getting to hear this music, but it should go without saying, I don't need to go to the theater to listen to Bruce Springsteen music. I can play it on my phone or my laptop, or I could buy a CD or a vinyl, right? I don't need to go to the theater. So, I don't really know if that's really a point on its score sheet, right? So looking here at the live chat, there are no comments. Why is no one leaving comments? These are always more interesting, these reviews. It's always more fun when we're able to kind of have a dialogue about the film. If nothing else, because you guys will say something that I didn't think of, or I forgot to add into my notes. So again, if you're watching live, it's always fun to see you guys put some comments and questions in the live chat. But as it stands right now, there's nothing in there. So I'll weep after this is over. So I'll just kind of move on from here. But overall, final thoughts. I thought this was okay, right? I think there was a lot of potential here. Because music biopics always have a certain floor of quality, but they often have a ceiling. And so this movie was only going to be so good on principle. But this one in particular, I think, had a lot more potential than other ones because they had made the decision to really focus on this little sliver of his life. But on some level, it feels like a creative decision, not because they were really interested in doing everything that this film, like that premise would allow for. It feels like more, we don't want to hear people complain about it being a conventional generic music biopic. And it's like, okay, but then if you're going to eschew those cliches, you have to actually do something interesting. I see Viviana did put a comment down. So I will read this at the 11th hour. She writes, I did think it was strange how much they wanted to touch on but refused to fully discover. I don't know what that means. It was strange how much they wanted to touch on but refused to fully discover. I'm not sure what that means, Viviana. So maybe you could put a follow-up, but, but I think even if I don't even know what specifically you're talking about, I think it reflects what I'm already saying, which is like they are afraid to really dive into things, right? And Vivian put a follow-up here. I didn't really realize that it was about this period of depression and self-discovery because it was always just him being cool, dark, and mysterious. Kind of, yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, if they had really leaned into that, then the film would almost be like the film embodiment of the spirit of Nebraska, right? Which is also completely, and my dad even said it when we were at the theater. He was like, he loves Nebraska, but he remembers when that came out, and him, like everybody else, was like, what the fuck is this? Like, it's just completely different. So in a lot of ways, had they leaned into what you're saying, Viviana, they could have, the film itself could have embodied that spirit of, like, surprising authenticity and surprising vulnerability. But again, I think the film was an assignment, not a passion project, ultimately. And I think the film suffers for that. And again, I would almost have liked it a little bit more. It's hard to kind of, say, it's a hypothetical, but it's a counterfactual, but maybe this would have been more enjoyable if it had a little bit more of a cliche storyline. Because at least then you have something to hang your hat on. Whereas with this, it's so kind of unconventional, to the point of it just becoming meandering, right? And Viviana also added here, always the cool guy, so he didn't seem as bothered as he was because he always kept his cool, not like, oh shit, he's very depressed. Yeah, I didn't know that either until my dad kind of informed me like a couple weeks before going to see the movie that, because you don't really get this sense from any of his music especially the music he's most known for, that he's secretly this like very tortured soul. Like that never has come through with his music. So again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, I think the film just doesn't do enough in any of the things it's trying to do in order for it to really land. So it's not a bad movie by any stretch, but I think I'm just going to have to give this a 6 out of 10. I think it's a net positive. It's okay. But I'm not sure if I ever really need to or really want to watch this again, right? It's kind of, you watch it, oh, that was interesting. There were some good elements of that, and then you kind of move on with your life. And you kind of, you go find other things to watch. So yeah, I'm giving this a 6. But that's it for this installment of Review Roundup. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like this video. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way, you never miss a video. And don't forget to comment below and let me know what you think of Springsteen, Deliver Me From Nowhere. Until next time, peace out.